we're not arguing about stuff on the margins right now, the two parties. Like we're not just having a debate about what should the marginal tax rate be, right? Like, or what entitlement reform might look like. You know, that's
not the 90s.
that is not what we're talking about. The Democrats are on record. Like if they were to take the majority in the Senate and had the House and had a president, they have vowed to, in the filibuster, pack the Supreme Court, federalize our elections, add states to the union, have open borders and amnesty. Like that, in those things would fundamentally change this country forever. I'm an optimist, but at that point, to me, the shot clock starts running on the Republic.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
And we are here for yet another fantastic episode. We're always grateful that you guys listen in. Today, we had on a fantastic guest, someone we were really eager to have on. But before I get to that, be sure to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find the backlog of this podcast, everything we have cooking as an organization. You can sign up for AM Fridays, which is our summer lecture series on the Hill. Interns from across Capitol Hill come by. We're doing foundational lectures on the public policies that matter, on immigration, trade, foreign policy, everything. I think when this episode comes out, the next one will be...
Who the next speaker will be?
Yeah.
Dude, I have
this Friday
no
is Mark
idea.
Krikorian, and anyway, whatever. Nick is going to look it up.
Look it up while you're
It's
talking.
a fantastic series. Sign up for it. We had over 75 people for our first one. We anticipate, based on previous trends, that'll be inching up over 100. It's in the Kennedy Caucus Room. We highly recommend that you guys join. That's on AmericanMoment.org.
That week's going to be David Azarad.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, you're going to want
a barn burner of it.
Yeah, you're going to want to be at that.
That's this Friday. But you can also find the backlog of this show and everything else we have cooking as an organization. I think there's just a little bit more time left for our fall fellowship. We started interviewing candidates today as we're taping this. So we highly recommend that you guys apply for that if you would like to come to DC. Look, this fall's your last chance to get in DC before, hopefully, we have an aligned president, the White House. So, but today we had on Eric Schmitt, the senator from Missouri, the junior senator, one of the most interesting members of Congress in either chamber. I have this longstanding bit, which is I think most Republican AGs are useless. But when they do something, when they choose to do something interesting, they end up being some of the most transformative elected officials in the country. And we've seen that across the nation, but specifically in Missouri, back to back. We had Senator Josh Hawley and Senator Eric Schmitt both spend time as Missouri AG and really transformed the nature of American public life through the aggressive lawsuits that they filed in those offices. So we were really eager to have Senator Schmitt on to talk about that, what he's been doing on big tech in the Senate, what he thinks we should do about DEI and ESG and a whole bunch of other issues. So we highly, highly recommend that you listen all the way through the end of the episode. He was a partner at his law firm and then decided to run for the Missouri legislature. He spent time as I believe the state treasurer. Then he went on to be the attorney general. Has really had a really interesting career in politics. There's this weird cultural dynamic where, people fetishize the idea of someone not being a career politician. And I agree in most cases, you want guys that are fresh, but with someone like Senator Schmitt, when they've actually done innovative, interesting things at every stage of elected office they've been in, I don't care how long they've been in there. And he's still pretty young. He's only 48 years old and has really, served with distinction, I think, in the legislature. So we just had a fantastic time. I don't know what you thought about it, Nick.
My mind was dominated the entire time by two things: space war and congressional baseball game.
Those are the last two things we talk about. It's recency bias.
No. It was, dude, the second he brought up space war, I had so many scenes from so many different movies in my head, but it's probably a lot more terrifying than that. Yeah. It was a great episode. Like you said, probably the most interesting senator that we have right now. Super fascinating guy, and you guys are really going to enjoy it.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun. So we highly recommend that you listen all the way to the end. Subscribe on YouTube, become a member, a Statesman or a Truther. Today in the members only segment, we asked the standard question, which is what are you paying attention to that no one else is? And he had a really interesting answer on that related to AI. But then we also just spent a good deal of time on the congressional baseball game, which is this Wednesday, and American Moment will be there. So come say hi. Stumbling. It's been a long day. But we'll go now to Senator Eric Schmitt, the junior senator from Missouri. Senator Schmitt, thank you for coming on the podcast.
It's great to be with you guys.
We always like to hear about how our guests got to where they are today. I think you have a pretty interesting career as elected officials go, one that will resonate with a lot of people in our audience who have been behind the scenes and kind of worked their way up. Tell us that story, how you got involved and what motivated you to take the leap. So
I grew up in a really blue collar neighborhood. My dad worked 7 days a week in the midnight shift. And so I always sort of, that's sort of my background as far as like the things that I saw when I was growing up. And I think the law sort of appealed to me at a relatively young age. I think I had an appreciation for history and then also the role, that the legal system provided as these guardrails so people could pursue their dreams. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of in the background, but running for office was never a thing. I mean, I was always would volunteer for people that I believed in. I went to law school. I was starting a family. I made partner at my law firm. Things were great. And then I became a dad, and my son, Stephen, who's now 19, was born. And pretty early on, he was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition. And so Stephen, to this day, is nonverbal, is epilepsy. So a lot of medical challenges. And he had a 4-hour seizure when he was young. And wow. You go through, I was educated by Jesuits, and this process of discernment about what do I really want to do. And it was a sort of a catalytic event for me to do something different. And so I ran for office. I served in the state Senate, and then, ran for statewide office. And then, Roy Blunt, I was Attorney General, and we can talk about some of that stuff. But then he announced he was retiring from the Senate and jumped into, really in Missouri, the first competitive open seat a Republican might win for the United States Senate in our states. Well, at least in 100 years, mm-hmm. Missouri has sort of trended a little bit more right. So although I did have a general election, there was a 21-way primary, and was successful there. And, now an honor of a lifetime to be representing the state that I love. I'm a 6th-generation Missourian, and it's just, I pinch myself because it's such a unique opportunity to advocate for my state in the Senate. So I think for me, it was this confluence of this background of service that I kind of had, this love for our country. And then, with my son's condition, saying, hey, you know what, I need to do more. There's something else I need to be doing other than just doing what I was doing. And so public office was my way to serve my state. So here we are. So I think it's interesting that it would have been this crazy competitive seat and you made it through. I think the voters probably rewarded what was a very interesting tenure in the Attorney General's office when you were in that role. I have this longstanding kind of rude thing I say, which is most Republican attorney generals are useless. They don't use the office to its highest potential, especially when there's a Republican in the White House and it's not as simple as Dem over there bad. Talk to us a little bit about how you thought about your tenure as Attorney General and why you sought out the kind of asymmetric opportunities that you did while President Trump was in the White House to really make a difference. Yeah. So really in my first 2 years as Attorney General, President Trump was in office. And then my second 2 years, Joe Biden was president. And those are, two very different people and times to serve. And I think that one of the things that I did early on was we were able to partner with, St. Louis and Kansas City had 2 of the higher murder rates in the country. And so, that office, you don't have original jurisdiction. The county prosecutors do, mm-hmm. but those areas were, and St. Louis had a Soros prosecutor. It was kind of a mess. Kim Gardner was a total disaster. She's out of office now, thankfully. But we decided, hey, what is it that we can do to help? And so we partnered with Trump's U.S. attorneys to tackle violent crime. We did something that had never been done before. We sort of cross-designated and deputized assistant AGs in our office to work with those U.S. attorneys as special assistant U.S. attorneys to prosecute things like carjackings and other, sort of violent crimes. You didn't have a original jurisdiction over homicides because there's no federal law on that, but we did everything that we could. And I think we had over 1,000 charges and a bunch of convictions, and I think did some good work there. And then interestingly, when Joe Biden came in office, sort of pulled the plug on that, which to me seemed like a pretty nonpartisan thing to be doing, fighting crime. But that isn't how the Biden administration saw it, unfortunately. So, but also I think the way I viewed that office, we really wanted to be innovative and be a leader in the AG space. And so, I ended up being chairman of the Republican AG Association and tried to help people along the way, but viewed it as sort of, what do we want to do to prevent federal overreach? What do we want to do to set the groundwork as far as state regulations go in our state? And then what do we do about local governments that overstep their bounds too, right? Because they're essentially political subdivisions of the state.
And that's a mindset that took time. Like I remember in the 2000s, Republicans would be like, local control, can't do anything if a local government does it. And that it was in the 2010s that mindset started changing.
Yeah. And I think look, going back to sort of civics 101 here, the states came together to create the federal government, right? To give it limited powers. Yeah. And everybody had to unanimously agree on what that looked like. You know, the Articles of Confederation failed and then realized, hey, there needs to be a better way here. So we agreed upon the Constitution. So there's federal governments of limited powers, but that power emanated from the states. And then the states confer certain powers and authorities to local governments, right? And when they go beyond that, now this played out especially during COVID, where we took a very aggressive stance in saying, look, you don't have any authority to force the masking of millions of people in your jurisdiction. School district, we sued 60 plus school districts during COVID and said, there's the legislature never gave you authority to change, medical protocols or quarantine status. Like if you've been in a room with somebody diagnosed, you can't be in school for 2 weeks. Yeah. So we were really aggressive in pushing back. And to this day, in Missouri, I'll have a parent come up to me without exception saying, hey, thank you for standing up for us during COVID, because there weren't a lot of people that were willing to do it.
Yeah. What did the Atlantic call you? Missouri's unmasked Avenger.
The unmasked Avenger. And I think that, in time, there's a danger of this stuff being memory hole. But remember, they were bulldozing skateboard parks and boarding up basketball hoops and, roping off playgrounds. And the consequences were dramatic for kids, loss of learning, the social anxiety, all of the things that went along with this, the depression. We can't let them forget about that. We can't ever let that happen again. But at the time, I felt like that was sort of a clarion call to sort of step up and do something to protect people from these local governments that were going out of their way to punish them, to sort of virtue signal, to kind of genuflect at the altar of Anthony Fauci and light the Fauci candle. It wasn't based on any science, but you had to have the courage to stand up and fight back. And I think that probably dominated my time as Attorney General. I viewed that as my role. And so, when Biden came into office, totally different era, right? Like immediately, war on energy, opened up the border. And so in our system of federalism, I thought it was really important for Missouri to take the lead. We had the capacity. I had a great Solicitor General, John Sauer, who's, clerk for Justice Scalia, some other great people in office, Justin Smith. There's so many people in that office that I can't take all the credit. We just had some people who were really smart, who worked really hard to protect the freedoms and the liberties of the people in my state and also across the country. We had the student loan debt forgiveness case that went to the Supreme Court and won. We filed that. That was an interesting case because we had the standing hook. There was a little known loan servicing agency in Missouri called Mohila that case entirely hinged upon, did anybody have standing to sue? Yeah.
And it was the only way that anyone found in the country to do it, right?
That's right. And if we wouldn't have sued, and trust me, I was in the middle of a Senate race and there were plenty of people saying, hey, I don't know if this is politically a right thing for you to do. It turns out the polling was, I didn't know at the time, but people saw how inherently unfair this was to have the truck driver and the waitress paying off the student loan debt of the college theater professor. So the Supreme Court slapped Joe Biden. Now he's trying to figure out other ways around it. We had the vaccine mandate case, the employer case. We were the first ones to file on that. And there was an interesting litigation strategy among the AGs there. We won on that at the Supreme Court. And then, of course, the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit, then now Murphy versus Missouri case, where we really uncovered, this is before Twitter files, this vast censorship enterprise between the federal government and some of the biggest companies in the history of the world, these social media giants, to silence Americans and to quell dissent. And
so talk to me a little bit about what that's like, because I got my start in state politics in a bigger state, Texas. And I know that when these companies come to town, come to wherever the state legislature is headquartered, they exert a long shadow and intense pressure on these small town legislatures. And so what was it like to take that on? What was the kind of pressure you faced? And, how did you go about deciding to do that?
Well, I think for me, if you take a step back and what sort of the uniqueness of this experiment that makes America exceptional is that, throughout the, human history, governments have tried to aggregate and exercise power that ultimately limited people's individual rights. And so the protections, of course, in the First Amendment and other amendments and in our Constitution is to protect individual liberty, right? You spread out power through federalism, both and separation of powers, both vertically and horizontally. All of that is meant to protect individual liberty. And chief among that, the first among that, is our First Amendment right to express ourselves. This idea that we have a right, a God-given right to fundamental human expression. That when I gave commencement speeches 5-10 years ago, those are the things that I was talking about, and how it's really important for us to stand up to that. Even if it's an opinion we vehemently disagree with, the ability to speak your mind is really important. And it's also, practically speaking, a pressure release valve for our country. Like if you don't feel like you can speak your mind in the town square, that's how you end up with sort of political violence, right? One of the ways that we diffuse that is people have an opportunity to be heard. And more of these discussions now are not just in the physical town square, but in the virtual town square. So when we saw to be perfectly honest, when we filed the lawsuit, we had some evidence of this. But once we got the literally thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of emails and text messages,
discovery is a wonderful thing.
It is. And by the way, one of the things that is, not talked about a whole lot unless you're a legal geek on this stuff is that we were able to get discovery prior to the preliminary injunction hearing. And if we wouldn't have been able to do that, we would have just been arguing, hey, we think there's something here. And we allege that, of course, in our complaint. But we were able to prove it. And so, on the 4th of July, literally on Independence Day, we got that incredible ruling that said, and the judge said, this is Orwellian. This is the most egregious level of censorship we've ever seen in the history of our country. And that was essentially affirmed by the Fifth Circuit. Now that case isn't, in front of the Supreme Court and it'll come down, and it could be Friday. It could be next Friday. Who knows? But no matter what, it did expose, again, the level to which the federal government with its immense authority was coordinating, colluding, and coercing with these big tech giants to censor speech on things like, guess what? The lab leak theory, the Hunter Biden laptop story, the efficacy of masks, all these things that were have proven to be true, they were trying to silence because it wasn't the regime's narrative. This sounds familiar in the world, right? We cannot let that happen in this country. And so I think you just have to have the courage. You have to know what you believe in the first place, right? And then the courage to stand up. And I was in an office where you could go do that. You could take action. And I think people appreciated that. And I'm sure some of that played into why people trusted me with this position to be in the Senate. They wanted a fighter to come here and push back against this effort by the left now, which is gaining more and more influence in these institutions, to fundamentally undermine what makes America a great place. And I'm guided by that here. And so I haven't changed at all. It's a different, you're in the Article 1 branch now in the legislative body. I didn't need any additional votes to go sue China or Joe Biden when I was AG. But there are very important structural reforms that need to happen in our government, I think, to make sure this stuff never happens again, too. So the lawsuits were important to shine a light. And you got to remember, this was before the Twitter files. So there's a couple of things that happened that expose it. We filed the lawsuit. Elon Musk buys Twitter. Twitter files exposes all this, and I think just blew everybody's mind, right? So I'm really proud of that. I'm proud of those cases that we brought. So at the local level, we were taking on school districts that were forcing the masking of 5-year-olds. At the federal level, we were taking on Joe Biden and a censorship regime and these unconstitutional student loan, basically election year buy-offs, but it didn't, it doesn't work. The younger voters see now how much more expensive everything is because of the terrible decisions the Biden administration has made. But and then at the state level, one of the other things we didn't sort of, even in our arguments before the courts, we didn't defer to the agencies. And you got another big important case that's up in front of the Supreme Court now, and whether or not the Loper-Bright case of whether or not the Chevron deference will remain. And my hope is that it'll be obliterated. We'll see. There might be some incremental step, but that's going to change this whole administrative state environment that we've lived in now for a couple of decades, that only has been supercharged by the left, who knows they can't get the votes to do things like ban gas stoves. So they just have some agency go do it for them. And so I think that dynamic hopefully is about to change. And then we're going to be left with what comes next. The legislature is probably going to have to be more prescriptive. That's a good thing. And so, we're already talking among colleagues about what that looks like post whatever that decision is.
I think these last few years have been deeply radicalizing to a lot of conservatives about the amount of power that these gigantic and mostly left-wing companies have over the entire country and over like individual Americans. I mean, the fact you brought up the Hunter Biden laptop thing, the fact that you literally could not tweet out the article was like,
right.
It just blows my mind. But did this big tech case in particular that you're talking about, did that sort of, I don't want to say change your opinion on corporate power, but like, were you more deeply radicalized by how bad it actually is?
Well, I do think that what has become clear to me is that we're not arguing about stuff on the margins right now, the two parties. Like we're not just having a debate about what should the marginal tax rate be, right? Like, or what entitlement reform might look like. You know, that's
not the 90s.
that is not what we're talking about. The Democrats are on record. Like if they were to take the majority in the Senate and had the House and had a president, they have vowed to, in the filibuster, pack the Supreme Court, federalize our elections, add states to the union, have open borders and amnesty. Like that, in those things would fundamentally change this country forever. I'm an optimist, but at that point, to me, the shot clock starts running on the Republic. Like at that point, the protections that have been in place for 200 plus years that the Democrats have no, they don't really blush at all anymore. I mean, we just had this impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas. It came over to the Senate, and for the first time in the history of our country, the Senate didn't have a trial. It's happened every single time articles of impeachment have come over. If the person's still in office or alive, there's been a trial. Now, there could be an acquittal and there could be a removal from office, but there's always been a trial. Chuck Schumer just decided we're not going to do that anymore, right?
Got to protect John Tester.
Right. Yeah, think about that. Or a news cycle or two just ultimately abdicated our constitutional responsibilities. So I think, to answer your question, I think people have seen now how radical the left is, the levers of power that they control, and people want to save this country. And so for me, was a motivating factor as Attorney General, and also a motivating factor for me to want to run for the Senate, because all these big debates are going to run through the United States Senate, in my lifetime. And being one of the younger senators at 48, hopefully there's a bit of runway to make a difference there and to protect the things that I believe in. And by the way, I don't believe that I have all the answers, but I think that you have to have an open dialogue and people being willing, sort of like the way Schumer runs our Senate floor. There's no amendments. There's no real debate. It's supposed to be the world's most deliberative body. It's the biggest kabuki theater in the world because all this stuff is orchestrated. You would think that somebody's elected by an entire state could stand on the Senate floor and say, I have an idea, and work to try to build a coalition on it. You can't do that. Chuck Schumer has consolidated all that power. So I think one of the real reforms that needs to happen internally as the Senate is we got to open that place up again and allow people to offer ideas and have more votes. People are afraid of these votes. This is kind of what we're judged by. We ought to vote on these things. And I'm not afraid of that. But Chuck Schumer certainly is. I
think the juxtaposition of I'm going to call it your reign as Attorney General in the state of Missouri is really interesting between the two administrations. You were talking about, you tackled a lot of things from, crime to COVID to a lot of this big tech stuff. My guess is, the federal government under the Biden administration was not at the time super content to just like let you do that.
Yeah.
What were some of the recriminations against Missouri, against you guys personally for?
Oh, there are people trying to disbar me. I mean, it's like, all sort. The media just sort of lost their minds. They don't like conservatives being bold. I mean, look, they control all of the major institutions, right? Whether it's Hollywood or, universities, the press. I mean, the thing that probably was the hottest of the topics, and I'm proud of. I think we blazed a trail there, and I wasn't the only one. There were some other AGs that were really working really hard, and we would partner with them. I mean, Jeff Landry, who's now governor of Louisiana.
Someone else who was rewarded for being bold,
right? And I think that's, to me, I think that's the lesson that can be learned here is people are starving for leadership. They're starving for people to stand up and say, you know what? No, we have a better path. but we're not going to allow you to destroy our country. We're not going to allow you to intimidate us and silence us, which is what this whole thing is about. And it's like when I speak up about DEI, we could talk about that too. Like, you're not gonna silence me. It's wrong. It's discriminatory. But I would say during COVID, it kind of crystallized this, because people who should have never had the power that they had it, and they wanted to exercise it, and they never wanted to let it go. And I viewed that as sort of this moment in time where you could see, OSHA was an agency created to make sure forklifts beep when they back up, like stuff like that, not force a medical procedure on 100 million people. Yeah. They were never given that authority. If you think that's a good idea, Congress should have to vote on it. Congress never voted on that, but they saw it as a way of, again, imposing their will on tens of millions of Americans. Same with masking. There was essentially kind of a travel ban. You couldn't attend a sporting event if you hadn't had the vaccine or you weren't wearing a mask. This is crazy, right? This is America. There's polling that show people, we're okay with people being sent off to camps if they hadn't been, had the vaccine. I mean, now all this stuff in full view, looking in the rearview mirror, is obviously nuts. But at the time, I sued those 60 plus school districts. It happened to be the peak day of Omicron. I didn't plan it that way, but people, some people were saying, what are you doing? And I just felt so strongly that parents should be able to make that decision for themselves. Individuals should be able to make these decisions, not government. And again, so I think it kind of crystallized where we were at. I think our side won on that. And as the passage of time makes that even more obvious. I mean, you just had Fauci here on Capitol Hill basically saying, yeah, we made up the 6 feet social distancing and masks really don't work. And in that Missouri versus Biden lawsuit, we took the deposition of Anthony Fauci. Yeah. And, I'm across this table. This is one of the last things I did as AG before I was sworn in. And he's literally across the table and the court reporter sneezed. This is in November of 2022. This is not March of 2020. The court reporter sneezed and demanded she wear a mask. I mean, this is the guy making these decisions. And we found out, all sorts of things. We were asking about masking. That we had an email from him he sent to a friend who asked, should I be wearing a mask on a plane? He's like, no, masks are totally ineffective. And here he is then on the stage because asked Dr. Fauci, we got a candle for him. Was just dispensing all of this, and people were taking as gospel. You weren't allowed to question. I mean, science, he was the science. The very essence of science is questioning assumptions. Yeah. Right. And so maybe I've just been a contrarian, and that's probably part of it a little bit. And I just felt like it was time to push back. So long way of answering your question, I think that woke a lot of people up to what was really going on. Yeah. And their attempt to silence people, I just don't think it works anymore.
I didn't see any of the clips. Did he wear a mask to the hearing today?
I don't think so. I don't think
He's over that now?
Yeah,
okay.
Right.
Just checking.
He's following his own advice finally.
Yeah. So DEI and ESG are interesting issues because I think that my narrative for the last 60 years is that the way that the DEI regime came into existence was largely as a byproduct of the legal system. It became the left enforced the DEI regime by making it legally risky for powerful institutions to not abide by it. And so I think that legal minds and lawyers, especially creative ones, will have a lot to do with what it takes to unwind the DEI regime, especially post Students for Fair Admissions and other cases that might work their way up. What's your macro theory? It feels like we now have an opportunity. The culture seems kind of tired of this stuff a little bit, but the left isn't going to step down easily. How do we actually unwind the pernicious influence of this ideology?
Well, I do think you're right. I think public opinion now, having seen what this really is all about, has shifted to the extent it was ever in favor of this. But look, the truth is DEI is cultural Marxism masked in flower language. Like it is, diversity and inclusion. I mean, equity is its own sort of offensive. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Guaranteeing a result. It is not real. But I think they tried to disguise the real intention here, which is cultural Marxism. It's this constant churning of a permanent revolution, essentially, right, to divide us, and by immutable characteristics, by race. And it is inherently racist. And I just think you got to call it out. And, dividing the room by oppressor and oppressed. I mean, one of the other things is AG, we you know, we had the power to enforce the Sunshine Law, which is essentially his FOIA. And the press in Missouri had always used this offensively, I guess, to sort of whatever do. And if I believe in openness and records and all that, but we started to say to these school districts, hey, what do you got on? What are you doing on DEI? What are you doing on critical race theory? And then, of course, the press was like, well, what is he doing now? He's going after these school districts.
Yeah, they start with critical race theory isn't real. And then when you find it, they're like, actually, it's good.
No, and then they'll say, well, it's not a course. Well, here's the thing. If it's in all your training materials for teachers and staff and administrators, it becomes how they view every classroom, how they view every scenario, which is entirely the point, right? The entirety of the point is to sort of, again, divide the room, and that's their model. And so, you know, we uncovered materials like the oppression matrix and the gender unicorn and all these just weird things that, you know, are being pushed on kids. And I think, you know, if you want to understand what's going on college campuses to some degree on this sort of pro-Hamas movement, look no further than we're, you know, at least a generation into this kind of ideology being pushed, which is who's the colonizer and who's the oppressor, as opposed to, you know, viewing people individually. I mean, one of the things I think, you know, I taught a class at St. Louis University for 2 semesters a few years ago because I wanted to get on a college campus. I want to understand what's going on. And I really do believe a return to civics diffuses a lot of this, because if you can talk about what is America, what is the American idea, what are our shared values, right? And you sort of get into the Declaration of Independence as this mission statement, right? And the Constitution adds a framework, again, for protecting people's individual rights. But ultimately, you know, when I try to use this example that when Tocqueville comes to America and he writes back in his travel dispatch, Democracy in America, he's trying to figure out what is making America dynamic, you know, in the early 19th century. And he writes back, and he's like, it's not the bureaucrats. You know, that's sort of what he thought it might be. They have better bureaucrats. But he says America's this nation of joiners, right? Like, we're involved in things. And so what defines me is, you know, I'm Catholic, I'm a conservative, I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan, I like beer, I like all these things that are part of who I am. And each one of you guys, right, that you're not one thing. But what DEI does, and this sort of, again, this cultural Marxism, it seeks to crystallize and sort of dehumanize people into one thing. And then that's the mechanism by which you can divide people. It never really worked by way of class in this country because people still fundamentally believe that you can achieve great things. You can come from a different station and become, you know, whatever.
And it's true. There's greater mobility here than there is.
Right. And because it's been defined by a merit, like a meritocracy, right? And we're not perfect, but that's the idea. They didn't work economically from an economics perspective. So it's been morphed into sort of this racial division. And I think you're right. I think there's a backlash, but I think we got to call it out. Again, it takes some courage to call this stuff out. A lot of people, you know, they're living their lives and they go through this, you know, they got a job. They don't want to get fired from their job, but they got to sit through this, you know, struggle session, you know, that is so offensive. And so I view it as part of my job to stand up for those people, right, who want to push back, but they're afraid of losing their job. Think how talk about a power dynamic. That's what that really is all about. So I think that you got to have people who are willing to stand up and then expose it for what it really is. And I think now the next step is, especially given you know, the admissions case last year by the Supreme Court, there's no legal justification for you know, whether it's race-based admissions or hiring practices anywhere. I mean, I've filed legislation in the federal government to get rid of every single DEI officer in the federal government. We don't need these people. You know, be a good person, treat people with respect. We should certainly highlight that. But this agenda, and you've got school districts all across this country that are paying literally millions of dollars to these consultants, you know, these DEI consultants. It's a total shakedown. And so anyway, I do think there's a legal aspect to all of this, and corporate America, I think, needs to sort of wake up and realize that you're not just checking a box here. This is really offensive stuff.
But when the cake is at least partially baked, you know, there are DEI officers that are not only in these explicitly DEI roles, but people who hold that worldview, who work their way through the corporate ladder or institutional ladder in these places. They are ideologically committed to enforcing this. At some point, right, like, actually extracting it from our institutions will take the force of law. And, you know, love what Stephen Miller and America First Legal are doing, but like, there's only so many lawsuits they can file. Like, what is your roadmap to how we actually like force this to get unwound in all of our major institutions in American life and actually undo it? Because I think it's going to be kicking and screaming that the institutions in many cases are going to stop doing this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, you know, we have to lead by example, I think, in government and say that, you know, this doesn't, I mean, if you watch any of the hearings that have, including on the Armed Services Committee, you know, these, you know, the Secretary of Defense or whoever, I mean, it doesn't, I don't care what their position is. They deserve to be called out for this because it's hurt. For example, in our military, it's hurting recruiting. Like recruiting is down. The Navy, it was down 20% last year. It's down 30% this year. And I asked the Secretary of Navy, do you think that your divisive DEI programming and indoctrination has anything to do with that? No. Like, not at all. Not at all. Yeah. Well, maybe the fact that you fired literally 5,000 sailors for not getting the COVID vaccine and you push this DEI stuff, maybe that is affecting our readiness.
You think we should rehire those guys?
I do, with back pay and a huge apology from Joe Biden, like a handwritten note. Yeah. But that's not going to happen. Well, what he said was actually, because this was my thing last year, rehire them all. And so I think to cover the sort of CYA, they made an attempt. And they said only 35 people responded. My response was, shocker. Look at the level of disrespect that they were, you know, their own government treated them. And so, again, I think that these are really important things to highlight. We can't ever let it happen again. On the free speech front, sort of getting at how do we combat this too? You know, I've got legislation that says not only do big tech companies on the private side lose 230 protections if they engage in censorship, but if there's a government actor involved in that, you can sue them individually. You can sue that individual bureaucrat. Mm-hmm. And I think that would change the culture here because right now feels like there's just not a lot of accountability for the bad actors here who engage in this. And maybe then they go to their supervisor and say, you know what, I actually don't want to do this because I'm legally liable. Like that is, I think, how we have to change the dynamic a little bit. And think about it, as opposed to just 25 AGs or a handful of them that want to be really aggressive on this, you'd have millions of Americans.
Yeah, stick the trial bar on them.
You know, I mean, I think we've got to look, these are serious issues, right? This is about people who've worked all their lives and being denied opportunities because of their race, or you've got, you know, people who want to speak their mind and they're being shut down, or they lost their medical license, right? Because they dared to ask questions. I mean, this stuff is all happening. And so anyway, I think there's some things we can do, but there needs to be structural reform, you know, on the administrative state side. I would say, you know, there's a few things. The REINS Act, I think, is critical. Like there's a fundamental disconnect right now. Like our system of self-government is based fundamentally on the premise that we're accountable, right? The voters can send you there, they can send you home, or they can send you back. Nobody knows who the deputy undersecretary of some agency you've never heard of is. They write a guidance letter, and your liberties might be on the line. Your generational family business might go under. There's no accountability for these folks. So, you know, the idea of that is to say, if you have a rule or regulation that, pick the number, mine would be really low, but let's say it's $100 million. That's the impact. Congress should have to vote on that before it goes into effect. Guess what? Hardly any of this stuff would actually ever happen, and that would be a good thing. But we've got to have, we got to build a coalition to get that done. And my hope is when President Trump gets back into office in January, I do think he's very serious about fundamentally dismantling the administrative state, and that is a very important reform that needs to happen.
So something like the REINS Act, obviously, you know, it would dramatically reduce, probably decimate, and then some, the amount of new regulations that would go into effect. What's your thought process on how we actually downsize the federal workforce if President Trump were to get back in there? You know, I think on the campaign trail, people like to talk in sort of large generalized slogans, abolish this department, abolish that. It's never as simple as that, right? And you know, the bureaucracy will always fight back. You know, as someone who's been in the weeds on this stuff, how do you think about the stepwise process by which we can actually meaningfully reduce the federal headcount?
Well, two things. One is, I think, you know, President Trump, they were on the right track with this because they were sort of, for every new regulation, they were removing some. I actually have a bill that says that for every new regulation you want to push, you got to pull back 3. Not only would you get rid of a bunch of unnecessary regs that have been on the books if they were ever necessary in the first place, you would also get that agency to think really long and hard about proposing the new one in the first place. So I think there's a dynamic that can change there too. But I think you fundamentally have to change I think this system that's in place that doesn't allow administrations to get rid of bad actors has to change. I mean, I think, when you come in, you ought to have the right to bring in more of your people or people who see the world, because I think that they did it with President Trump. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people do it who will, sort of resist this sort of change, and they think they can just wait out everybody. That dynamic has to change. That has to change. What is it? Reagan's quote: "The closest thing to eternal life is a government program or a bureaucracy, whatever." Something like paraphrasing, but like that is true, because what happens is, somebody's got some great idea. There's some new agency, but nobody ever went back and did anything about the thing in the first place. And we've seen. Look, there's a lot of great people working, but for the federal government. But there's a lot of people who should no longer be working for the federal government. And there's buildings all across this town where people aren't even showing up to work. There's like 40% of the people who actually show up. So I think there's some real reforms that need to happen, and I do think that in those 4 years, it has an opportunity, and I intend to work with the Trump administration on this. There's an opportunity to have real reform in a way that I don't think any president really took on in this way. I think it's become, especially the last few years, the abuse of these agencies and the weaponization. I mean, look at what DOJ is doing, has come into full view, and something's got to change. So
let's talk about the weaponization of government. President Trump was convicted on all 34 counts by Alvin Bragg's jury up in New York. What was your first reaction as a former law enforcement official?
I can't actually believe this is happening in our country. Like, I'm not trying to be dramatic here. I actually can't believe that we now have Soviet style show trials, which is all that was. That's all that was. Show me the man, I'll show you the crime. He ran on getting Trump, right? And so he brings this ridiculous, it'd be kind to call it a novel legal theory, right? Where they didn't even actually have to articulate the underlying crime, right?
Yeah, Mershon was saying, like, you don't have to agree on what the crime is. You don't have to agree on
what the crime is.
It's like throwing out 1,000 years of common law.
Right, like, actually, it's a criminal, like, that's the thing. It's a criminal proceeding, right? Like, on purpose. There's supposed to be all kinds of protections for the government to take away somebody's liberty. And I say that as a former prosecutor. It's supposed to be really hard to do that. You're not supposed to like be able to deny the testimony of somebody who worked for the FEC who said, actually, none of this stuff was illegal. Like NDAs, that's not a campaign contribution or expense. Like they were not allowed to hear that testimony. The jury instructions are so flawed. They're riddled with reversible error everywhere. I think that ultimately he's vindicated, but they got what they wanted. They wanted to be able to call him what they're going to call him now. And that ought to scare the bejesus out of everybody in this country, regardless if you like President Trump or not. This idea that you can put your political opponent on trial in a friendly jurisdiction with a prosecutor who decided to run on that is terrifying. And the founders warned about this in the Federalist Papers. I mean, Madison wrote about this. Like, the really scary thing is this sort of weaponization of our criminal justice system. And there's all sorts of protections. I mean, that's why trial judges typically err on the side of letting more in, because they don't want to be reversed. But guess what? If you actually don't care about being reversed and you just care about interfering with the election and you just want to get the conviction, that dynamic is radically different. And that's exactly what happened. I went up there. It was the last day of testimony. Costello was on the stand, and I saw some of these rulings, which were nuts. For example, the prosecution was able to ask about an email, ask him to talk about the email on redirect. Trump's lawyers wanted to ask about the same email that the prosecutors brought into evidence, and they were denied the ability to ask about the email that was already asked about. I mean, these rulings were nuts, and again, like I said, riddled with reversible error. But this is an incredibly dangerous road to go down, and I think they know it. But so many of them suffer from Trump derangement syndrome. They cannot get over it. It totally broke their brain, and they're willing to do this. And it's hard, like I said, it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle once you do it.
They just wanted to be able to call him a convicted felon on the campaign trail.
Absolutely.
Like that was it.
That's all. Yep.
Well, and the thing that's interesting about this is like the jury was obviously confused. Like, how many times did they come back and ask, like, can you read us those instructions one more time? Like,
well, they weren't even allowed to have the instructions.
Yeah.
Like they had to come back. They were read to them, and then they weren't allowed to have them. Yeah. I mean, as a lawyer and as a prosecutor, like, it's just such an abuse of authority. I think that you could tell stories or write a book about the cases I didn't bring as attorney. You know what I mean? Like, you want to be, very certain that the action you're taking that could land somebody in prison is the right thing. And I think that Alvin Bragg totally betrayed his oath. He ran on it, and he was going to do anything. Like, he was going to find anything. And it's a total joke. It's a total joke.
So in response to this Soviet-style show trial, which I totally agree, that's what it is, you and I think it's up to about a dozen of your colleagues have put out this letter talking about how you're going to comport yourself in the Senate, given this sham trial. Tell us a little bit about the thought process that went behind that letter and what you guys are going to be doing moving forward.
I think the American people want a response here. And by the way, this is totally different in the sense that we're working within the Senate rules to thwart a radical agenda by Joe Biden. I mean, a lot of the Senate operates on unanimous consent, and a lot of these sort of nominees that people don't, pay too much. They're not on the front page of the New York Times, require a lot of cooperation. But here's the thing. If you're willing to do anything, including jail your political opponent to stay in power, like, there has to be a response there, right? And I think this is a step in that direction to say that, until this dynamic changes, and I think that this is a really important moment. And I say this as somebody that like I said at the very beginning of this, one of the reasons I wanted to be a lawyer as a kid, I didn't know any lawyers growing up. There's nobody in my family that I didn't know any lawyers until I got to law school. I didn't know any lawyers. But to me, the law was this, again, it created these guardrails for people to live their lives in a society that we have here, where you could pursue your dreams and you weren't going to be unduly harassed or prosecuted, right? This throws all of that into question, right? Like, if it can happen to Trump, it can happen to other people. Like, people think this is just about him. I mean, I think they're obsessed with Trump. But this is a playbook now that's in place. And so anyway, I think this is a response, and it's just not going to make their life any easier in the Senate to pass, again, this sort of radical stuff they want to do. Now, truth be told, Chuck Schumer, he's got these confirmations and he's got some show votes, but there's probably not a lot going to happen in the remainder of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And with Chuck Schumer being the majority leader, that's not such a bad thing, honestly. Because I think if they were actually in charge, the level of destruction that they would be, wreaking on the American people would be pretty dramatic. So I think it's incumbent upon us to have some sort of response, and this is part of it. But ultimately, as President Trump has said, the revenge is success here, like winning the Senate majority, expanding the majority in the House, and, President Trump getting back into office. But there is just such, this whole idea that he's a threat to democracy is sort of infuriating, right? Like, just some of the things we've talked about. The Biden administration engaged in, according to a federal judge, an Orwellian censorship regime we've never seen in this country. And they wanted to keep Trump off the ballot in some states and put him in jail for the rest of his life. So, I think we've found the real threat to democracy, and it is him and it's the Democrats. And even though we're a constitutional republic, and I always sort of but I use their terms as the sort of threat to democracy, TM. But yeah, I mean, we're in a really important time in our country's history, and I hope people are waking up to that, and they understand that this election is about so much more. Look, the front burner issues for people are immigration and inflation, no doubt. But I also think beyond all of that, if the Democrats were actually ever to get, like we talked about at the beginning, real control of both the House and the Senate and the presidency, I mean, I think they've crossed the Rubicon here. that it's just about aggregating power and exercising that power. And I think that in many ways being conservative is sort of counterculture, but it's incumbent upon us, I think, to defend the republic now.
Yeah. It's interesting. That letter that you and your colleagues put out was in some ways a roll call sheet for where the Senate is headed. Leader McConnell has decided to step down at the end of this year. I'd love to just hear a little bit about what cultural changes in the Senate that you're looking forward to when Republicans take back the majority, different ways of doing things that you and your younger colleagues are hoping for if President Trump were to retake the White House.
Yeah, and look, I think there's some really smart people in the Senate, and we don't fully utilize the talents of many members of our conference. And I think that by opening up the process, amendments and this idea of like filling the tree where nobody has, which sounds to people who don't know what this is.
Our audience knows.
Yeah, okay. Like that's crazy to me. Like it's nuts.
Episode 2 was Rachel Bovard. They know.
Okay, yeah. So, but like, state legislatures don't operate that way.
Yeah.
In the Missouri Senate, any of the 34 senators can stand up in the Senate floor, offer an amendment, and they get a vote. I mean, with some exception, there would be filibusters on some big things that things don't happen or they do happen. But I find it perhaps when people ask me what are your biggest surprises, and I think for me, that is the biggest surprise, that there is not more of an opportunity for individual senators. I mean, that's what the Senate is supposed to be, that kind of institution, right? Because it's 100 people. We don't do that. So I do think that whoever the next leader is, speaking to those sort of internal reforms will be really important. And then also having our priorities more accurately reflect where the American people are.
So not Ukraine.
You're right. I mean, honestly, like I've told people this, like,
I heard that it's the greatest priority of the Republican Senate was Ukraine aid.
For a while, I mean, exaggerate a little bit. Every conversation started and ended with Ukraine. And look, we should have a robust policy debate about that. I happen to believe that it's ridiculous for us to spend hundreds of billions of dollars securing another country's border when we don't do anything to secure our own border. And I can tell you in Missouri, with almost complete, to a person, no one has come up to me and said, you know what, Eric, the most important thing you can do is go up there and get, 60 plus more billion dollars for Ukraine. It just isn't, it's not where the American people are. And that comes from, I think, a sort of a different view on foreign policy, a more realist approach.
Yeah.
What are the core national interests for us? We do not have the capacity, the industrial base, to do all of these things. We just don't. In China, to me, it's really a pivot to China in the sense that the 21st century is going to be defined by who wins this great powers competition between the United States and China. They're playing, I'm on the Armed Services Committee, they're playing in a meaningful way in space. The first shots in the next war will be in space. It'll look nothing like anything anybody's ever seen in human history. A lot of the things that we take for granted will be on the table. They've built islands and fully weaponized islands in the South China Sea. They have a bigger Navy, not a better Navy, but a bigger Navy than we have. They have 12 naval shipyards. We have 4. Each one of theirs has greater capacity than all 4 of ours combined. That's who we're dealing with. And they have designs on world domination. They believe that the last 200 years has been this great humiliation, and they have no intention of yielding to the United States. So they're coming, and they're here. And the idea that we have to have the ability to make enough stuff for ourselves. And by the way, there's a role for us to play in the world. I'm not an isolationist at all, but I'm saying we have to have a reprioritization here. And anyway, so I just think it's I would say, some of the newer members look at that issue differently. It's an important debate in our conference, but my point is, there's a lot of things that are top of mind for our constituents, like energy policy and inflation issues and immigration. And we ought to be leading on those kinds of issues. And I think that what people get frustrated with back home is when they see our priorities not matching with theirs. And when you go and you say, this is the most consequential election in our lifetime, we need to win. And then we win and we don't do something with that aligns with their values, you're going to have problems. But the punchline is, I'm optimistic about where we're headed on that front. I think the Republican Party is speaking more to those issues. I think there's a realization now. And again, getting back to my background, I grew up in a blue collar family. We are now the party. It's a multi-ethnic working class party. I think that's a great thing. It's such an opportunity for us. And you look at the share of votes like Trump's doing on Black voters now. He's winning among Hispanics, younger voters. And we talk about COVID, right? This awakening that happened. Biden, COVID, all of this stuff, younger voters see all this too. And I think they're rejecting all of that and they're moving towards us, and we ought to fully embrace that. And I think that, again, you got some of the newer members, I think that understand, and also other members. I'm not suggesting it's just, just people who've been elected in the last couple cycles, but I do think I feel good about where we're headed. I
do have to say, backing up like 2 minutes, space war as a prediction might be the coolest and also most terrifying prediction we've ever had on this podcast.
Well, I tell you, my wife tells me, like, she's like, you have to figure out a way to talk about China without scaring the bejesus out of people. And I haven't figured it out yet because, I mean, when you see this, the commitment they have to where they want to be in the next 50 years. And meanwhile, we're inundating K through 12 with critical race theory. Like, we better figure this out. And but again, I think it's going to take some courage and some leadership to see what that landscape looks like, to talk about it in an articulate way and have some solutions that help get us in a better place.
As a final question, just for our subscribers, I want to ask you about what's the thing that you're paying attention to that no one else is. But for those of us who are subscribed on YouTube, you can subscribe to our membership program. You can be either a statesman or a truther. You go to youtube.com/American Moment to be able to find all of that. So, Senator, we always like... If you're listening to this, you're almost certainly a highly sophisticated news consumer, but even the most dogged of DC politicos need a news aggregator to help them out. We're big fans of Upward News here at American Moment. Ari David has actually been a previous guest on this show. We highly recommend you check out that episode. But Upward.news is a way that our team keeps in touch with all of the crazy news stories going on around the world. Your Twitter feed is not necessarily 100% reliable to get a proper cross-section of everything going on that matters. Upward News is a fantastic young media startup that is really putting together fantastic newsletters and social media content that helps people digest the news, especially if you're tired of being on the phone with your parents and explaining news stories to them multiple times a week because you're the politico in the family. I highly recommend encouraging them to follow Upward.news. They do a free 5-minute daily email that you can sign up for at readupward.com, or even better, www.ihatefakenews.com. It's time for a palate cleanse from politicos, punch bowls, and pucks. Try Upward News today. We highly recommend it. Ari's an incredibly smart patriot, and they're a new player on the block focused on cutting through the noise and delivering smart analysis. Please check them out. That's awesome. Well, Senator, where can people keep up with everything that you're doing and follow your great work?
Well, I'm on the Twitter now, X machine.
Yeah. I love that these senators are now like on Twitter more often.
Oh, yeah.
Like they're typing, not the staff. It's
right.
Great.
No, I do my own stuff. Eric_Schmitt. I'm on the Insties and the Facebooks. So we're on all the platforms, and Schmitt for Senate is on the other side, and then they can go to all the official stuff too. We try to keep it lively and keep people informed.
You should have like a based Mike Lee type handle where you just call it the Unmasked Avenger.
I know. Right. Yeah, that's what I should do. Right. Yeah.
You got your comms guy in here, right? Right. Make him do it right now.
Yeah. No, I think it's an effective way to sort of get the word out. And I think you're going to continue to see that like diffusion of information. I hope so. I think that's a good thing. So.
Absolutely. We love to see the senators actually give their unfiltered opinions. So thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks for having me.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I certainly enjoyed taping it. As always, be sure to go to AmericanMoment.org, sign up for AM Fridays, look at the backlog of this podcast, rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Go to YouTube and subscribe. Become a statesman or a truther. That's our paid membership program. You get the episode 24 hours early, and you get the special members only segments. This time we talked about the congressional baseball game and Senator Schmitt's fears about woke AI. Thank you guys as always for listening. We really do appreciate you tuning in. This is like episode 158. It's like old hat at this point. We plonk down and we ask guests interesting questions, and we're grateful that you guys listen. We're going to continue to be ramping this up. So if you have any ideas, please be sure to email them to podcast@americanmoment.org. And look, this episode was driven from the other side. You know, Senator Schmitt's team reached out. They were interested in coming on. So if your member can actually survive under an hour of scrutiny with, no talking points and just having a conversation, be sure to reach out. We're always happy to consider having them on. Thank you. We'll see you guys next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is americanmoment.org.